Godzilla 1998 was the first American attempt at adapting the iconic Toho monster Godzilla for American audiences. Directed by Roland Emmerich and starring the likes of Matthew Broderick, Hank Azaria, and Jean Reno, the film was considered a massive flop for critics, general audiences, and Godzilla fans alike. I'm Zach from the Five Nights Tavern, and today we will be taking a look at Godzilla 1998. Let's get started. A little bit of background. An American version of Godzilla had been trying and failing to get off the ground for quite some time, until two producers, Kerry Woods and Robert Fried, went to TriStar and Columbia Pictures in search of a deal. After initial failure, they went to the then CEO of Sony Pictures, Peter Guber, who saw faith in the project. Sony then negotiated with Toho for the rights of Godzilla and several of the other monsters from the Toho lineup. Toho eventually would send Sony a dossier which gave them rules on how to treat Godzilla and the other monsters. The first version of Godzilla was set to be directed by Jan de Bont and released in the summer of '96. De Bont would kind of veer away from the nuclear origins of Godzilla in favor of him being a creature created by Atlantis to defend against an alien threat known as the Griffin. He would then walk away from the project after TriStar shot down his proposed budget of just about $100 million-ish. Ironically, the final version made by Emmerich ended up costing nearly $150 million. Which version would you have preferred to see? Personally, the fight with the Griffin seems pretty interesting to me. Direction of the project was then handed over to Roland Emmerich and his producer buddy Dean Devlin, who were about to come off of their latest hit, a little-known movie you might have heard of called Independence Day. The two of them signed on with Emmerich stating, "I told Sony that I would do the film, but on my own terms, with Godzilla as a fast-moving animal out of nature, rather than some strange kind of creature." The two were then given full control of the project and were given the script from the original Godzilla project. Emmerich would go on to ditch the script stating, "It had some really cool things in it, but it is something I never would have done. The last half was like watching two creatures go at it, and I simply don't like that." Emmerich instead decided to develop new ideas from scratch, stating, "I didn't want to make the original Godzilla. I wanted nothing to do with it. I wanted to make my own. We took part of the original movie's basic storyline in that the creature becomes created by radiation and it becomes a big challenge. But that's all we took. Then we asked ourselves what we could do today with a monster movie and a story like that. We forgot everything about the original Godzilla right there." Emmerich's vision for Godzilla was clearly very different from anything else that had been attempted, and for better or worse, this is the version audiences would receive in the summer of 1998. The design of Godzilla became a topic of contention as Emmerich decided to completely scrap the original design in favor of something totally different. He hired designer Patrick Tatopoulos to design Godzilla once again, and if that name sounds familiar, yes, that's what they gave Matthew Broderick's character Nick a last name for. Insert Patrick Tatopoulos, Nick Tatopoulos, I'll mess up his name, and we'll all move on here.
It's Tatopoulos.
Emmerich told Tatopoulos that the creature needed to be able to run very fast. So Tatopoulos went about designing it based off of an iguana and coloring him to blend in with New York City streets. After the design was finalized, they went for a meeting with Toho with a few pieces of concept art and a 2-foot-tall figurine of their new Godzilla design. The pair then met with several of Toho's main people. Apologies in advance for messing up these names. They met with Toho chairman Isao Matsuka, Godzilla film producer Shogo Tomiyama, and Godzilla special effects director Koichi Kawakita. They unveiled Tatopoulos' artwork, and the Toho trio remained silent for several minutes. Emmerich recalled, stating, "They were speechless. They stared at it, and there was silence for a couple of minutes. And then they said, 'Could you come back tomorrow?' I thought for sure we didn't have the movie then." Tomiyama later recalled that it was so different we realized we couldn't make small adjustments. That left the major question on whether to approve it or not. Even though Tomiyama was not allowed to remove the artwork and the mannequin from the studio premise, Tomiyama visited Godzilla producer and creator Tomoyuki Tanaka, whose failing health prevented him from attending the meeting, to explain Tatopoulos' design, stating, "I told him, it's similar to Carl Lewis with long legs and it runs fast." Matsuka approved the design the next day, stating that Tatopoulos kept the spirit of Godzilla. With all the approvals out of the way, the film could finally begin production. Let's discuss the actual story of Godzilla. Following years of nuclear testing in French Polynesia, an unknown creature emerges to attack a Japanese fishing vessel, leaving only one survivor, who, following being questioned by an unknown group of Frenchmen, is only able to reply with one word: Gojira. Cutting over to Dr. Nick Totopoulos, a nuclear scientist, is brought in to help study a trail of wreckage in Panama and Jamaica, leading him and his companions to the wrecked fishing vessel with massive claw marks down the side. Nick later deduces that this creature is some sort of mutated animal created by nuclear testing. The creature then makes his way to New York City and begins to leave a trail of destruction in his wake, forcing a massive evacuation of the entire city and an attempt by the military to destroy it at all costs. The film also follows a number of smaller subplots, including the French Special Forces team led by Philippe covertly trying to investigate and neutralize Godzilla from the shadows, and Nick's ex-girlfriend Audrey, who, along with her friends Lucy and Animal, work for a major news station during the attack. Audrey is followed as she attempts to become a reporter by any means necessary and her subsequent failures. Without giving too much away on the off chance that you haven't actually seen this film, the narrative has a lot going on with its several overarching plot lines that gives the movie a fairly quick pace, despite there being several times during the film where little is actually going on. The movie holds a reputation for being a fairly poor attempt at a Godzilla film. However, the film is not all bad. Let's start with the actual design of Godzilla himself. Although it isn't exactly what I would call a good Godzilla design, I still think it's a fairly cool creature design overall. Had this not been a Godzilla film, I feel like it would have been better received. Another interesting aspect of this Godzilla is his intelligence. Although he is portrayed as more of a wild animal, he exhibits a clear ability to problem solve. From outflanking military helicopters to recognizing that the fish was a trap the second time around when the military tried to use it, going so far as to recognize missile launchers and what they will do to him. It's a quite fascinating addition, and it makes this Godzilla more entertaining to watch than if he was simply just a wild animal. I also enjoyed the subplot with the French trying to quietly clean up the mess Godzilla was making. If that had been more fleshed out, I feel like it could have been a more entertaining narrative than the main one we actually got. The concept of the film alone is quite intriguing. The thought of Godzilla rampaging around in New York City is enough to get any fan excited. It's just a shame that the people in charge of bringing this movie to life didn't respect Godzilla and what makes him such a compelling character in the first place. Things can very quickly get out of hand if we attempt to discuss everything wrong with this film. There's simply too much to go over given the amount of time I have here. This review is already longer than any of our previous ones, but with that being said, let's focus on some of the negatives that bother me the most. Let's start with the characters. Aside from Jean Reno and maybe Hank Azaria's character, the cast here leaves a lot to be desired. Their performances are very hit or miss, with poor delivery of admittedly questionable lines. Some cast members do the best they can with what they have, while others, like Broderick, end up delivering their lines with very little effort at times. And considering that Broderick is essentially the main character, you would hope he'd be able to get something out of the lines he has. The plot itself is all over the place, bouncing around from military operations to French spying and Audrey's plight to become a reporter, which is undoubtedly the weakest of the plots, as she comes off as a whiny and unlikable character that makes very questionable at best decisions, and even screwing over Nick in a selfish bid to advance herself. The military is portrayed as hopelessly incompetent, causing arguably more damage to the city by wildly firing missiles and bullets into surrounding buildings while being seemingly incapable at hitting the giant lizard literally standing directly in front of them. For God's sake, Godzilla is able to outsmart 3 submarines and even uses the torpedoes from those subs that got fired at him to take out one of their own subs in a spectacular show of stupidity on the part of the military characters presented here. The CGI in the film also doesn't hold up very well, which can be expected from a film released in '98, but older films such as Jurassic Park hold up far better than this one, despite being released over 5 years earlier. Hell, even Independence Day, another Emmerich film from 1996, holds up better than Godzilla. The practical effects presented in this film are fine, but Godzilla himself looks awful, standing out like a sore thumb for all the wrong reasons. On a VHS, it might look okay. Even on a DVD, it may be passable. But when I rewatched this on a 4K TV with the remastered version, it was just plain terrible to look at. The final negative I'm going to discuss is the mini Godzillas, or the Godzilla Raptors, if you will, that plague the third act. These monstrosities are a clear rip-off of the raptors from Jurassic Park and turn the film into some sort of ridiculous horror sequence as the characters attempt to evade them using equally silly strategies such as throwing gumball dispensers down to trip them up or blasting chandeliers to distract the raptors long enough to escape. Honestly, I could go on. There's so much wrong with this film that it's hard to find a stopping point, but I think you get the point with what I've highlighted here. With my personal gripes out of the way, let's take a look at Godzilla's actual reception to get a feel for how well the film did. On a budget of about $130-ish million, the film needed to make more than double that to be considered any kind of success, with Sony itself reportedly looking for a big $100 million opening as the film released around Memorial Day weekend. Unfortunately, the film only opened with about $44 million and went on to gross about $136 million domestically, plus about $242 million internationally, giving the film a total gross of about $379 to $400 million. These numbers aren't bad, but certainly well below the lofty expectations that Sony had for this film. The critical response to the film was less than stellar as well, with many critics bashing the movie for its lack of tension and intelligent thought. Roger Ebert gave the film 1.5 stars out of 4, noting that one must carefully repress intelligent thought while watching such a film. The movie makes no sense at all except as a careless pastiche of its better, and yes, the Japanese Godzilla movies are, in their way, better, if only because they embrace Drek instead of condescending into it. You have to absorb such a film, not consider it, but my brain rebelled and insisted on applying logic where it was not welcome. Ebert also pointed out in his review that the characters Mayor Ebert and his assistant Gene were Devlin Emmerich's jabs at his and Gene Siskel's negative reviews of Stargate and Independence Day. Siskel placed the film on his list of the worst films of 1998, and I personally find it very strange that Emmerich went through all the trouble of essentially putting his biggest critics in his film only for him to not do anything with them. He doesn't even have Godzilla eat them or anything. It's all very strange. The film currently sits with about a 16% on Rotten Tomatoes and a 5.4 out of 10 on IMDb, showing that time hasn't changed what people thought about this film very much. As far as Emmerich and Devlin themselves, they both regret how the film turned out. Emmerich stated that it suffered from a rush production to meet the release date and that the film wasn't screen tested, but he did defend the film, saying that it was better than the critics had said and that it was financially successful, but he just never took it too seriously, stating, "I was never a big Godzilla fan. They were just the weekend matinees you saw as a kid, like Hercules films and the really bad Italian westerns. You'd go with all your friends and just laugh." This kind of sentiment throughout production doomed the film to fail from the very beginning. One of the original producers, Rob Fried, who we talked about earlier, was furious about how the whole thing turned out, stating, "The Sony executive team that took over Godzilla was one of the worst cases of executive incompetence I have observed in my 20-year career. One of the golden assets of our time, which was hand-delivered to them, was managed as poorly and ineptly as anybody can manage an asset. They took a jewel and turned it into dust." Well, you took the words right out of my mouth, Rob. This film was clearly handled by people that simply didn't understand what they had, and they squandered it, turning what should have been a surefire hit into a divisive nightmare. Toho itself was very critical of the American Godzilla, with veteran Godzilla actor Hiro Nakajima saying, "Its face looks like an iguana, and its body and limbs look like a frog." And Kinpachiro Satsuma, another actor, walked out of a screening at a convention stating, "It's not Godzilla. It doesn't have a spirit." Kaneko later pondered on the treatment the character was given by the studio, stating, "It is interesting that the US version of Godzilla runs about trying to escape missiles. Americans seem unable to accept a creature that cannot be put down by their arms." Toho would later go on to trademark the design, renaming it simply to Zilla and using it in the film Godzilla Final Wars, where it would be quickly killed by a true Godzilla. Overall, Godzilla 1998 serves as a cautionary tale of everything that can and will go wrong in the process of filmmaking. What should have been an incredible collaboration between Sony and Toho drowned in a sea of mismanagement and terrible creative decisions. Quite simply, these people had no business making this film. It doesn't even qualify as a Godzilla film. only in name. I'm Zach from the Five Nights Tavern, and as always, cheers.